The morning Margaret discovered the first footprints, she was watering her prized hydrangeas, the blue ones that had taken her 5 years to cultivate just right. The prints were small, maybe a size 5 or 6, cutting directly across the bed where she'd spent last weekend laying fresh mulch. She stood there for a long moment, the garden hose dripping uselessly at her side, watching the water soak into the compressed earth. Margaret lived on Maple Street in the kind of neighborhood where things were supposed to be orderly, where fences stayed intact and property lines meant something, where you could leave your gate unlocked on a Saturday morning without wondering what you'd find when you got home. She was 63 years old, retired from teaching English at Lincoln High for 35 years. Her husband, Robert, had passed 8 years ago, leaving her the house, the backyard, and an almost crushing amount of silence. The hydrangeas had become her project, the thing she did with her hands when her mind got too quiet. The footprints appeared on a Tuesday. By Friday, she'd found muddy prints on her back porch, a soccer ball wedged against her shed, and what looked like grass stains on her recently repainted deck. She'd seen them now, 3 kids ranging from maybe 7 to 12, cutting through her property as a shortcut to whatever existed beyond the northern tree line. Their timing was inconsistent, which meant it wasn't a calculated route, but rather an impulse. The path of least resistance. That Saturday morning, Margaret did something she'd been hesitating to do. She walked 3 houses down to where the Hendersons lived, or rather, where Corinne Henderson lived with her 2 sons and a daughter who seemed to exist primarily in a state of barely contained chaos. Corinne opened the door with her phone pressed to her ear, still talking to someone. She held up a finger, "Give me a second," and Margaret stood in the doorway, watching Corinne's expression cycle through annoyance, resignation, and finally something that might have been dismissive recognition. "Kids," Corinne said, as if that explained everything. "What's wrong?" Margaret had prepared this carefully in her head. She'd visualized the conversation, imagined various responses. What she hadn't prepared for was the implicit accusation in Corinne's tone, the idea that Margaret was here to complain about something trivial, something that children do. "Your children," Margaret began carefully, "are using my backyard as a shortcut. There's damage to my landscaping and—" "Are they hurting anything?" Corinne interrupted. "That's not really the point. The property line." "Are they hurting anything?" Corinne repeated, firmer this time. "Like actual damage or just walking through?" Margaret felt something tighten in her chest. "They're cutting through my flower beds and there are wet prints on my deck. The mulch I laid is displaced, and it's the principle of—" "I'll talk to them." Corinne was already closing the door. "Sorry, Margaret, we're busy right now." The door clicked shut with a finality that felt personal. The footprints continued. If anything, they multiplied. Margaret started keeping a log. Not obsessively, she would tell herself it wasn't obsessive, but methodically. She noted dates, times when she saw the children or evidence of them, and the specific damage. A broken branch on the Japanese maple, a deliberate path worn into her back lawn. Once, she found them actually sitting on her back porch, eating what looked like sandwiches, while talking about some boy named Derek who apparently had nice abs. She called Corinne again. This time, Corinne didn't answer. Margaret left a message that she hoped sounded reasonable and not at all like the rambling of someone alone too much of the time, though it probably did. She spent 20 minutes drafting it, deleting paragraphs, starting over. She didn't expect a call back. She didn't get one. What she did get was evidence that Corinne had spoken to the children, because for exactly 4 days the footprints stopped. The backyard was peaceful. Margaret watered the hydrangeas and felt a small flutter of something like victory. Maybe Corinne had listened. Maybe the message had gotten through. On the 5th day, the children returned. This time they were bolder. Margaret watched from her kitchen window as a boy, the oldest, probably 11 or 12, actually kicked at her decorative fence, testing its stability. They were laughing. The girl was doing cartwheels on Margaret's lawn, leaving marks in the grass. The youngest was picking dandelions from Margaret's yard and tossing them in the air like seeds. Margaret went outside. "Hey," she called out, her voice sharp in a way that surprised even her. "You're not supposed to be here." The children froze. The oldest boy straightened, his expression shifting into something defensive and resentful all at once. He was tall, already approaching that age where he'd be taller than Margaret, where her authority would mean nothing backed only by her voice and her 70 years of being raised to respect property and boundaries. "It's just a yard," he said. "It's my yard," Margaret replied, "and I've asked your mother." Our mom said we could come this way, the girl interrupted. She was 9, maybe 10, with the kind of confidence that only comes from never being told no in any meaningful way. She said it's fine as long as we don't, like, destroy anything. Margaret's jaw tightened. Karen had said no such thing. She did not, and you are not welcome here. Please leave. The oldest boy rolled his eyes, actually rolled his eyes at her, and they ambled off, not in any hurry, treating her exit demand like a gentle suggestion. The girl continued her cartwheels as they walked, as if the whole thing was theater, as if Margaret's anger was performance. When they were gone, Margaret stood in her backyard and felt something crystallize inside her. Not anger exactly. Anger was too simple a word. It was something more architectural than that, a decision being constructed, one careful brick at a time. She went to the hardware store that afternoon. The fence materials cost more than she expected. $1, $200 for the wood, hardware, and the consultation with the bored teenager who worked in the lumber section and clearly thought she was insane for wanting to repair a fence that looked fine from what he could see in the parking lot. She hired a contractor, a man named Jim, who came by on a Wednesday and gave her an estimate of $2,800 for labor. Margaret wrote the check without flinching, though the act of it made her stomach clench. Robert's insurance money had been good, more than good, but she'd never been the type to spend frivolously. She'd raised a generation of students, many of whom had told her, years later, that she was the only teacher who'd made them feel like their words mattered. She'd saved. She'd been careful. Now she was going to pour money into a fence that should never have needed this much attention, all because Karen Henderson couldn't be bothered to parent her children. The fence went up over the course of a week. It was beautiful, actually, 6 feet tall, treated wood, solid enough that you couldn't see through it. It completely blocked the view from Karen's property into Margaret's backyard. It also blocked her view of anything beyond her own space, which had the strange effect of making her backyard feel less like part of a neighborhood and more like a compound. The day the fence was completed, Margaret stood on her back porch and felt a complicated mixture of triumph and isolation. She didn't see the children for 2 weeks. She wondered if they'd found another route, or if Karen had actually told them to stop, or if they were simply testing the boundaries of the fence, looking for a weak point. She was watering her hydrangeas when she heard the sound of something metallic striking wood, sharp, deliberate, and definitely intentional. Margaret set down her hose and walked to the fence line. She pressed her ear against the wood and heard it clearly, a stick or pole striking the fence rhythmically. Thwack, 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 like a prisoner marking days on a wall. "Stop that," she shouted through the fence. The sound stopped. There was a moment of silence, and then she heard the girl's voice, the youngest, probably around 7 now that Margaret thought about it. "Our mom says you're being really mean. She says you're a grumpy old lady who hates fun." Margaret's breath caught. "She says," the boy's voice added, "that you're why her and Dad got divorced, because you complained about us to Dad's lawyer." That wasn't true. Karen's ex-husband, David, lived in Portland and hadn't been part of the picture for 3 years. But the fact that Margaret's name had been involved in that narrative at all, that she'd been written into their family story as a villain, made her feel something like vertigo. "Go home," Margaret called through the fence, and her voice sounded very small. The sounds resumed, now definitely intentional, definitely targeting the fence itself. Thwack, 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 the rhythm of children enacting their mother's grievance. Margaret stood on her side of the fence, hands trembling, and tried to remember when exactly things had stopped being reasonable. The footprints had evolved into this. Karen had decided, apparently, that Margaret was the problem. That Margaret was the kind of woman who begrudges children their joy, who builds walls instead of understanding, who values property over people. What Karen didn't understand, what Margaret would never explain because pride was a stupid thing to die on, and yet here she was, dying on it, was that it had never been about the footprints. It had been about the word no, about a boundary respected or not respected, about whether your home was actually yours or just a temporary holding space that anyone could walk through whenever they pleased. Margaret started documenting everything again, but differently this time. She took photographs of the fence damage, the marks where sticks had struck, deliberately and repeatedly. She recorded the dates and times. She noted when the children appeared, always after school, always between 3:30 and 5:00 p.m. on weekdays, sometimes on weekends. She documented the sounds, the audacity. She also started researching. The internet had answers for everything, it turned out. Articles about difficult neighbors, forums where people discussed property disputes, videos of people installing electric fence systems designed to humanely deter animals without causing harm. The language around those systems was interesting. Deterrent rather than punishment, discouragement rather than retaliation. Margaret wasn't thinking about electric fences. She was thinking about something else entirely. One evening, while scrolling through a gardening forum, ostensibly looking for advice on why her hydrangeas had developed some kind of fungal issue, she came across a thread about backyard chickens. The conversation had started innocuously, someone asking about egg production and chicken breeds, but then it had evolved. "Fair warning," one commenter had written. "If you get them, they will come. Everyone wants fresh eggs. People will actually try to steal them. Also, they're loud. My neighbor hates them, but there's not much they can do about it. I checked the ordinances." "How loud?" someone had asked. Picture a prehistoric pterodactyl having an existential crisis at 6 a.m. Every morning, no exceptions. Margaret had closed her laptop and poured herself a glass of wine. Then she'd opened it back up. By midnight, she'd read 17 articles, watched 6 YouTube videos, and discovered that Maple Street in her township had 0 restrictions on backyard chickens as long as you had enough space and didn't have a rooster. The noise from hens was technically legal. She drank her wine and thought about the sound of children's laughter, about the phrase, "grumpy old lady who hates fun," about Corinne's implicit blame for a marriage that had fallen apart for reasons that had nothing to do with Margaret. By the time she fell asleep at 2 a.m., something had decided itself inside her. Not anger anymore, something colder and more practical. Revenge, Margaret thought, as she drifted off, didn't have to be elaborate. It just had to be legal. She placed the order on a Thursday. 12 hens, mixed breeds, all guaranteed to be productive layers. They would be delivered on a Tuesday morning. She also ordered a coop, fencing, food, bedding, and everything else recommended by the 3 different YouTube channels she'd binge-watched over the past 4 days. The delivery arrived at 7:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, while Margaret was standing in her backyard wearing overalls and holding a clipboard. The truck backed up to the gate, and a man in a blue uniform handed her 6 plastic crates, each containing 2 chickens, all making their distinctive clucking sounds. Margaret had never owned chickens before. She'd never owned many animals at all. Robert had been allergic to cats. But she'd done her research obsessively, the way she used to research lesson plans before she had to teach something new. The coop was prefabricated, though assembly still took most of the morning. She'd hired Jim, her fence contractor, to help, along with his teenage son. By noon, the structure was up, a charming little red coop with a wire run attached, positioned on the far side of her property, as close to Corinne's fence line as was practical. "You're gonna love fresh eggs," Jim said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "My wife has 6 hens, worth every penny." Margaret thanked him and wrote another check, this one for the installation work. When they left, she was alone with her new livestock. She opened the first crate. The hens emerged cautiously, pecking at the grass, exploring their new territory with the curiosity of creatures that had spent their lives in close confinement and suddenly found themselves with unlimited space. They were beautiful, actually, a Rhode Island red, a golden-laced Wyandotte, a buff Orpington, and Araucana. She'd chosen them partly for their egg production, partly for their temperament, and partly, if she was being honest with herself, which she tried not to be, for their noise levels. Chickens, she'd learned, made noise. Consistent, frequent, loud noise. Not just the rooster crow, which she didn't have, but constant clucking, squawking, and the distinctive sound of hens announcing that they'd laid an egg. It was a sound designed to carry, a sound that traveled across property lines. Margaret watched them explore, occasionally bending down to pat one of the calmer hens, and felt something like peace for the first time in weeks. The sound started at 6:15 a.m. the next morning. Margaret heard it from her bedroom, the distinct, loud, almost triumphant clucking of hens, along with the scraping of their feet on the coop floor. She lay in bed and smiled. She didn't know how long it would take before Corinne complained. She'd given it thought. Corinne might not even realize they were chickens at first. She might attribute the sound to some neighbor on the other side. But eventually, within days, Margaret thought it would become clear what had happened. The waiting was its own kind of satisfaction. Margaret got out of bed, made her coffee, and went out to the backyard. The morning was beautiful, cool, but with the promise of warmth. The hydrangeas were recovering nicely from their fungal issue. The fence was solid and imposing and exactly what she'd wanted. And in the coop, her hens were settling into their day, clucking and scratching and being fundamentally, blissfully themselves. Margaret threw them some scratch grains and felt like a woman who'd finally moved a piece on a chessboard that had been hanging over her life for months. The complaint came on a Saturday morning, 3 days after the chickens arrived. Corinne didn't come to the door herself. Instead, Margaret received a visit from David Chen, who lived directly behind her property, 2 houses over. David was a kind man, mid-50s, who kept to himself and had never seemed to have issues with Margaret before. He looked embarrassed as he stood on her porch, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "So Corinne mentioned," he started, clearly uncomfortable, "that you've got chickens now, and they're, pretty loud in the mornings." Margaret held her expression absolutely still. "Chickens are loud, that's their nature. They're legal in this township with adequate space, which I have." "Yeah, I know they're legal, Corinne's kids have been having trouble sleeping with the noise, and she asked if maybe you could move them further back in your property, or—" "Where they are is fine," Margaret said. "They're on my property, they're performing their natural function, there's nothing illegal about it." David nodded slowly, the way someone nods when they've received the answer they expected but hoped not to get. "Right, I figured you'd say something like that. I told Corinne it probably wasn't a thing you'd want to change, but she asked me to try." He started to back away. "Well, sorry to bother you." Margaret watched him walk back to his car, and she felt a small spark of satisfaction. He'd been the messenger, not the source of the complaint. But Corinne had sent him, which meant Corinne was already annoyed. The chickens had already accomplished something. The noise continued. In truth, the hens were no louder than Margaret would have expected. They clucked in the morning, clucked in the afternoon, made a ruckus around 4 p.m. when they were settling for the evening. It was louder than silence, certainly, but it wasn't constant. And if you'd ever been to a farm or even driven past one, you'd have recognized the sound as entirely normal. But normalcy, Margaret was beginning to understand, was contextual. In the suburban silence that people had paid good money for, the sound of farm animals wasn't just loud. It was an assault on the carefully constructed peace. The second week, Margaret started finding notes in her mailbox. The first was typed, printed on what looked like a formal letter. "To my neighbor, it has come to our attention that you have introduced livestock to your residential property. While we understand that backyard chicken farming is technically permitted in our township, we must formally request that you consider the impact on neighboring families. My children are having difficulty sleeping. My wife has had to leave for work early on several occasions to get away from the noise. Perhaps you could consider sound mitigation, a larger coop structure, more insulation, or relocation of the animals. We would prefer to resolve this amicably. David Henderson." David had signed it, even though Corinne had clearly written it. That seemed like the point, actually, to hide the actual source of the complaint behind her ex-husband's name, to use their son's shared custody arrangement as a shield. Margaret read the letter twice and then set it aside. She didn't respond. There was nothing to respond to. She was breaking no laws. She was doing nothing wrong. But then, and this was the thing that made her understand this was escalating, she found something else. It was in her mailbox the next day, this time not signed, printed in an angry, uneven font. "You could move the CHICKENS if you weren't such a selfish bitch. My mom CRIES about you. You ruined our family. This is what you deserve." The handwriting looked like it belonged to a preteen. The boy, probably, the oldest one, the one who'd rolled his eyes at her the day she'd told them to leave her yard. Margaret stood in her kitchen and read the note, and something twisted inside her. She'd expected anger from Corinne. She'd expected legal complaints, noise ordinance violations, eventually perhaps a cease and desist letter. What she hadn't expected was to be blamed for Corinne's marriage falling apart. She'd said nothing to David Henderson's lawyers. She'd never complained to him about the children in a way that would have reached him. The narrative that Corinne had constructed, the story she'd told her children, that Margaret was somehow responsible for the dissolution of their family, had nothing to do with Margaret and everything to do with Corinne's own need to have a villain in her story. Margaret kept the note. She didn't know why. She filed it away in a drawer with the other documentation she'd been keeping. The third week brought an actual visitor from the township. A man in khaki with an official badge and a clipboard. He was polite, professional, checking on a noise complaint that had been filed. "I understand you keep chickens," he said, standing on her property with the bureaucratic patience of someone who'd been to 30 houses already that week. "I do, legal as I'm sure you know. I have adequate space, no rooster." "Right. Well, the complaint indicates that the noise level is unreasonable during early morning hours, before 7 a.m. There are actual ordinances about that if the noise meets certain decibel levels." "What is the decibel level that was measured?" Margaret asked, knowing exactly what his answer would be. "Well, we haven't measured it. The complaint was filed based on perceived noise levels, which is why I'm here, to assess the situation personally." They stood in her backyard while the hens clucked peacefully in the morning light. It was almost 10 a.m., and the noise level was absolutely reasonable. The official man looked embarrassed. "I'll be honest," he said. "The sound right now doesn't seem excessive to me, but if it gets to unreasonable levels during early morning hours, there's potentially a violation. The complaint came from," he checked his clipboard, "a David Henderson at 447 Maple Street." The complaint came from David Henderson, but the actual grievance came from Corinne Henderson, who lives with him part-time due to custody arrangements, Margaret said flatly. "She's angry that I have chickens. I'm legally allowed to have chickens. The noise is not excessive." The official looked caught between following procedure and recognizing a territorial dispute when he saw one. "Okay. Well, if the noise becomes unreasonable, or if there are further complaints, we can revisit this. But based on what I'm hearing now, there's no violation." He left, and Margaret felt the first small flutter of unease. She'd won this round, but Corinne was learning. The next complaint would be more strategic. The next move would be better planned. The next move came on a Tuesday afternoon. Margaret was inside reading when she heard the sound of something metallic hitting the fence again. But this time there were more impacts coming from different angles. When she went outside, she found the 3 Henderson children systematically hitting the fence with branches. Sticks, actually, deliberately chosen for size and weight. They weren't trying to hide it. They were doing it openly, aggressively, with the confidence of children who believed their mother would back them up. "Stop that," Margaret called out. "You started it," the girl shouted back. "You're being mean." "We're not hurting anything," the boy added. "We're just hitting the fence." And technically they weren't. Technically, hitting a fence with sticks, while obnoxious, while clearly intended as harassment, wasn't property damage or destruction or anything that Margaret could legally stop them from doing. It was the kind of gray area where being right legally and being satisfied in practice didn't overlap. Margaret went back inside and called the police. The dispatcher listened to her explain the situation and clearly bit back whatever response she wanted to give. "So they're hitting your fence with sticks," the dispatcher confirmed. "Deliberately, in retaliation for the chickens." "Are they damaging it?" "Not significantly, but..." "Okay, we can send someone out if you'd like, but technically that's not illegal unless there's actual property damage occurring. And if it's just tapping..." The dispatcher's tone made it clear what she thought of the situation. "Just send someone," Margaret said, and hung up before she could hear the sigh. The police car arrived 40 minutes later. By then, the children had gotten bored and left. The officer, a young woman with tired eyes, stood with Margaret while the chickens clucked peacefully in the background. "So you're saying the neighbor's kids are hitting your fence?" the officer asked, not quite managing to hide her skepticism. "Deliberately and repeatedly, it's harassment." "Have they damaged the fence?" "No, but..." "Have they trespassed on your property?" "They're hitting my fence from their property, but the intent is clearly to harass." The officer nodded, the way someone nods when they understand exactly what's happening and have determined it's below their pay grade to care about. "I can talk to their parents, but unless there's actual property damage or threats, there's not much I can do. If it happens again, document it and file a report." She didn't say it, but Margaret heard it anyway. This is a waste of police time. The message was becoming clear. Margaret had entered a space where she and Corinne were now locked in a kind of low-level conflict that the systems designed to mediate such things, police, township ordinances, the general rules of civil society, would not actually resolve. Because everything Margaret was doing was legal. Everything Corinne was doing was barely illegal. It was a chess match where both players were following the rules, but one of them was playing for keeps, and the other was just starting to realize what she'd actually agreed to by putting the chickens in the backyard. Margaret sat at her kitchen table one evening and tried to reconstruct the moment when she decided this was proportional, when complaining about children cutting through her yard had transformed into this. This thing with fences and chickens and notes in mailboxes and police visits. She couldn't find the moment. It had been gradual, one small decision stacking on top of another, until she'd looked up one day and found herself in a position she didn't quite recognize. The woman in the mirror looked like her, same face, same hands, but she was doing something Margaret had never done before. She was winning. The problem was, victory in a situation like this didn't feel like victory. It felt like a door had been opened that couldn't be closed again. The fourth week brought the lawyer's letter. It arrived in a formal envelope on official letterhead from a firm downtown that Margaret vaguely recognized as being associated with neighborhood disputes. The letter was addressed to Margaret J. Whitmore and laid out in careful legal language the parameters of the noise complaint. Karen had filed a formal complaint with the township, documented the dates and times of noise, measured the decibel levels, apparently with some kind of app that might not be admissible in court, but certainly looked official in a threat letter, and was now requesting that Margaret either relocate the chickens to the far side of her property, soundproof the coop, or face potential legal action. The letter was careful not to actually threaten anything specific. It just outlined what could happen if Margaret didn't comply. Small claims court, nuisance suits, an escalation of noise complaints that might eventually result in being forced to remove the chickens. Margaret read it 3 times and then set it aside. She did not respond. There was nothing to respond to. She was once again breaking no laws. She was doing nothing wrong. But here was the thing that had started to bother her. Karen didn't seem to care anymore whether Margaret was breaking laws or not. Karen had decided that Margaret was the problem, and she was simply going to keep escalating until something broke. The letter had an implicit message, underneath all the careful legal language. I have resources. I can afford a lawyer. I can make your life difficult even if I can't actually win. Margaret sat in her backyard on a Friday evening, watching the chickens settle into the coop for the night, and made a decision. She'd been thinking about it for days, the possibility, the risk, the actual consequences. But watching the chickens, watching the piece of her backyard, she understood that she'd already crossed the line that mattered. She was no longer the woman defending her property. She was the woman actively disrupting someone else's peace. The question was whether she was going to lean into it or back away. She thought about the note that the boy had written, the one that called her a selfish bitch and blamed her for his parents' divorce. She thought about Karen's decision to weaponize everyone around her, David, the children, the township officials, in a campaign of harassment that was technically not harassment because it stayed just on the side of legality. She thought about the word no and what it meant when no one listened to it. And then she picked up her phone and made a call. "Hi, yes," she said to the person who answered at the farm supply store. "I'm interested in purchasing additional chickens. How many would you have available for delivery?" They came in a larger truck this time, in crates stacked 6 high, making a sound that was less like a chicken farm and more like the avian equivalent of a military mobilization. Margaret had decided on a mix, more layers for maximum egg production, a few broody types for good measure, and 4 Orpingtons specifically because they were allegedly the loudest breed available for home use. She'd also upgraded the coop system, purchasing 2 additional structures and having Jim build a larger, more sophisticated setup that maximized the density of the birds while still maintaining adequate space and care conditions. The new layout took up nearly half of her back property, creating a whole section devoted entirely to chickens. If someone looked over the fence line from Karen's property, all they would see was a comprehensive, well-maintained chicken farm. Margaret paid $4,300 for the new birds and equipment. She'd stopped doing mental math about the total cost of this project somewhere around $12,000. Her retirement savings could absorb it, but just barely. This wasn't a practical expense. This was pure intention. Jim came back to help with the installation, and even he looked slightly concerned. "That's a lot of chickens," he said, staring at the expanded setup. "You planning on selling eggs or something?" "Or something," Margaret agreed and didn't elaborate. By that afternoon, she had approximately 48 hens on her property. The noise levels had, indeed, increased substantially. The first sign of real panic came around 6:30 a.m. the next morning, when Margaret heard something that might have been Corinne actually shrieking from her property. Margaret was in her kitchen, dressed and caffeinated, watching the chickens through the window, when she heard the distinct sound of her neighbor losing her composure. It wasn't screaming. It was worse than that. It was the sound of someone genuinely, viscerally disturbed. The sound of a woman who'd woken up to what she'd perceived as a relatively manageable situation transformed into something that felt, to her, catastrophic. Margaret poured another cup of coffee and tried not to smile. The response was actually faster than she'd expected. By 9 a.m., Corinne's lawyer had sent another email, CC'd to David, to the township, to apparently anyone else Corinne could think of. The tone had shifted from measured complaint to something closer to desperation. The situation has escalated significantly, the letter stated. The recent addition of significantly more livestock has created an untenable noise and odor situation. This appears to be a deliberate campaign of harassment. We are requesting immediate action from the township to enforce nuisance ordinances. Margaret read the email while sitting at her kitchen table, and she felt a strange, complicated sense of satisfaction. Corinne was now using the word campaign. Corinne was now admitting in writing to a lawyer that she believed Margaret was deliberately targeting her. The problem was, proving intent was difficult. Margaret was technically just raising hens. People were allowed to have chickens. The township ordinances didn't specify an upper limit on how many chickens you could keep on a residential property, as long as you had space and maintained reasonable standards of care. Margaret's hens were well cared for. They were healthy, well-fed, living in adequate structures. There was nothing technically illegal about what she was doing. The township inspector came back, this time with a supervisor. They looked at the chickens, counted them, checked the structures, observed the waste management system. They consulted their ordinance handbook. They measured noise levels at various times of day. When they were done, the supervisor spoke to Margaret in her backyard. His expression caught between admiration and concern. "So technically this is all compliant," he said carefully. "You've got the space. You're maintaining the birds properly. The structures are solid. The noise levels, while elevated, don't exceed the decibel thresholds outlined in our ordinance, especially during permitted hours. Oddly enough, our ordinance allows for up to 50 birds on a residential property with your square footage." "So there's no violation," Margaret said. "No violation," the supervisor confirmed. "But I've got to ask, is this vendetta something you want to take on permanently? Because neighbor disputes like this, once they start, they tend to get worse before they get better." "I'm just farming," Margaret said simply. "Is there an ordinance against that?" "Not that I can find," the supervisor said and sighed. The letter from the lawyer escalated again. This time, it was threatening small claims court. Corinne was documenting every morning, every instance of the noise, building what she apparently believed would be a case for nuisance harassment. Margaret almost wanted to point out the obvious, that you couldn't successfully sue someone for legally operating a legal farm on their own property. But she didn't. Instead, she focused on the chickens. She was waking at 5:30 a.m. now, moving between the different coops, checking on the birds, making sure they were all healthy. It was a surprising amount of work. The watering, the feeding, the egg collection, the coop maintenance. She was doing something, and it mattered, and it showed results in ways that her quiet retirement hadn't quite managed. She was also, she had to admit, doing this partly to listen to Corinne suffer. The children stopped coming through the yard. That was interesting. Either Corinne had finally, forcefully told them to stop, or they were simply staying inside more, given the noise situation. Margaret occasionally saw them at the window of Corinne's house, looking out at the fence like prisoners wondering what was happening on the other side. There was a strange guilt in that, though Margaret tried not to examine it too closely. One afternoon, David Chen came by again. He looked older than he had during his first visit, worn down in a way that Margaret recognized as caught in the middle between two people who are both right and both wrong. "Corinne's considering just moving," he said without preamble. "She's looking at properties in a different area, quieter neighborhoods. She says she can't do this anymore." Margaret felt something in her chest twist. Moving. "Yeah, she thinks it might be better for the kids, honestly. New school, new start, away from the noise and the conflict. She's pretty unhappy. I didn't ask her to move, Margaret said, and it sounded defensive even to her own ears. I know, but you knew she would eventually, didn't you? David looked at her directly, and there was something in his expression that managed to be both understanding and deeply disappointed. This was always going to drive her away. That was the point, right? Margaret didn't have an answer to that because the honest answer was yes, and no, and something more complicated than either word could contain. Instead, something shifted in her approach. She stopped fighting through lawyers and township complaints. She stopped trying to use official channels. Instead, one morning, Margaret found her standing at the fence line with 2 of her 3 children behind her. Margaret had been collecting eggs, the daily ritual that had become meditative, almost therapeutic. She had about 2 dozen a day now, more eggs than she could possibly use. She'd started bringing cartons to her church, leaving baskets of them at neighbors' doors, trying to find a purpose for them beyond the symbolic. She turned and saw Karen standing there, and every excuse she'd constructed about this situation. It's legal, it's proportional, she started it, collapsed in the face of seeing her neighbor in person. Karen looked terrible. She had dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. Her hair, which had always been carefully styled, was pulled back in a messy bun. She was wearing the same yoga pants and oversized sweatshirt that Margaret had seen her in 3 days running, clothing that suggested she'd stopped bothering with presentation. "Why are you doing this?" Karen asked, and her voice wasn't angry. That was the thing that got to Margaret. It wasn't angry, it was just broken. "Because you wouldn't listen," Margaret said. "You're children." "We're children being children. Kids cut through yards, that's what kids do." "You told me to come to your house. I came to your house, Karen. I asked politely. You essentially told me to deal with it." Karen's eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. "I was busy. I was going through a divorce. My ex-husband had just moved out. I had 3 kids and a part-time job, and I was barely holding it together, and you came to my door asking me to punish my children because they walked across your grass, and Karen swallowed. "I wasn't kind to you. I know I wasn't, but this is insane. You have 48 chickens, 48. You clearly hate me. You clearly hate my children. You built this whole thing," she gestured at the massive chicken farm, "just to hurt us." "It's legal," Margaret said. The words sounded hollow. "I know it's legal," Karen's voice cracked. "That's what makes it worse. You're legally destroying my life, and there's nothing I can do about it. Do you know what that feels like? To be outmaneuvered by someone who's technically correct but morally bankrupt." Margaret opened her mouth to defend herself, and nothing came out. "I can't sleep," Karen continued. "My daughter can't sleep. My son wakes up angry every morning. We've all been to a therapist, multiple therapists, because apparently I raised kids who don't respect boundaries and a neighbor who's decided we deserve punishment. And the worst part, the actual worst part, I deserve some of this. Maybe not all of it, but some of it. I was dismissive. I didn't take you seriously. I was a bad neighbor." The girl, Margaret remembered her name was Lily, was probably 9 now, was crying. The older boy, Marcus, looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. "I'm moving," Karen said finally. "We found a house in Riverdale, quieter neighborhood. We're moving in 3 weeks. I'm leaving my job, uprooting my children from their school, and we're moving because of 48 chickens and one woman who decided she needed to win more than she needed to be decent." Karen turned and walked back to her property, the children following. Margaret stood with an egg basket in her hands and felt something that was almost, but not quite, like guilt. That evening, Margaret sat in her living room and looked at the wall where a photograph of her and Robert used to hang. She'd taken it down after his death, too painful to see his face every day, but she still remembered it clearly. Robert at a beach somewhere, squinting at the camera in the moment before he'd gotten sick, before everything had changed. Robert had been the kind of person who could admit when he was wrong. He'd done it with Margaret dozens of times over their 37 years of marriage. He'd say something thoughtless, hurt her feelings, and then he'd actually apologize, not the kind of apology that came with explanations or justifications, but the kind that started with "You're right. I was wrong. I'm sorry." Margaret had taken pride in never needing to do that. In being the person who thought things through, who didn't act rashly, who respected boundaries and rules and the proper order of things. But she was starting to understand that what she'd been doing wasn't respect for boundaries. It was a form of cruelty dressed up in the language of principle. She found Karen's number through David. She called on a Thursday evening at 9 p.m. when she figured Corinne would either be asleep or already past the point of caring about propriety. Corinne answered on the fourth ring. "What?" "I want to help with your moving costs," Margaret said. "I'll pay for the movers, I'll contribute." "No." "Corinne." "No, I don't want your money. I don't want your apology. I want you to keep your chickens, and I want you to feel what it's like to have someone deliberately disrupt your life because you're not perfect. I want you to understand that not everything can be solved with checks and good intentions." "Then what do you want?" Margaret asked, and she was crying now, which surprised her. When had she started crying? "I want you to sell the chickens," Corinne said flatly. "I want you to dismantle this whole thing, and I want you to spend the rest of your life knowing that you did this, that you let your pride matter more than kindness. That's the punishment I want for you, the only punishment that fits." "I'll sell them," Margaret said immediately. "Good." The line went dead. Margaret contacted the farm supply store the next day. They were able to find buyers for most of the birds, local farmers, hobby farms, a few people who wanted cheap laying hens. The process took a week. The coop structures came down over 2 days. By the following Wednesday, her backyard looked the way it had before the chickens, empty, quiet, and completely devoid of purpose. She stood in the space where the coops had been and felt absolutely hollow. The hydrangeas had suffered during the chicken farm expansion. The birds had damaged some of the flowering branches, kicked up soil. Margaret spent the weekend repotting them, pruning them carefully, trying to coax them back to health. The work was meditative but not satisfying. She was just going through the motions of being the person she'd been before, and it didn't fit anymore. Moving day came on a Saturday in late August. Margaret watched from her window. She didn't go outside, as moving trucks pulled up to Corinne's house. She watched Corinne direct the movers, watched the children carry boxes, watched the whole life disruption unfold. David was there helping, moving between Corinne's property and his car with an expression of tired resignation. By late afternoon, the house on Maple Street was empty, and by evening, Corinne and her children were gone. Margaret stood in her quiet backyard and understood for the first time that she'd actually gotten exactly what she'd wanted. Corinne had left. The neighborhood was quiet again. There were no more footprints in her flower beds, no more children laughing, no more boundary violations. 6 months later, Margaret's mailbox still occasionally received letters from Corinne's forwarding address. Some were bills, things that hadn't updated yet. Some were handwritten notes from the children, birthday thank yous for cards Margaret had sent, drawings they'd made in their new school, messages that tried to maintain a connection that Margaret had severed. Marcus had made the local middle school basketball team. Lily had started piano lessons and, according to a note from Corinne, was surprisingly talented. The youngest, Thomas, had a friend now. Apparently they lived on a street with actual neighborhood kids, not isolated houses surrounded by fences. Margaret read these updates and felt each one like a small, deliberate wound. She joined a grief counselor's office in January. Dr. Reeves was in her 50s, with kind eyes and the particular wisdom that came from watching people damage themselves over and over and still believing they could change. "Tell me about the chickens," Dr. Reeves said during their third session. Margaret had told her about Corinne, about the footprints, about the fence, about the escalation. But she'd presented it as a story about boundaries and self-respect. A story where Margaret was the victim who'd finally stood up for herself. "What about them?" Margaret asked. "Why chickens, specifically? Of all the ways you could have responded to Corinne and her family, why did you choose something that would directly impact her sleep?" "It was legal," Margaret said. "I know it was legal. I'm asking why chickens." Margaret sat with that question for a long time. She'd asked herself versions of it late at night, while lying awake in a house that was finally completely quiet. "Because I wanted her to feel what I felt," Margaret said finally. "I wanted her to understand what it meant to have your peace disrupted, to not be able to control your own environment, to have someone deliberately targeting you using technically legal methods." "And did it work?" Yes, she understood. She left. "Do you feel better?" Dr. Reeves asked. And that was the question, wasn't it? Margaret thought about her backyard, empty and clean and perfectly maintained. She thought about the hydrangeas, recovering slowly, blooming in colors that no one was there to admire. She thought about the silence, which had turned out to be not peaceful but isolating. "No," Margaret said, "I feel worse." The guilt had characteristics that Margaret hadn't anticipated. It wasn't a constant thing. It wasn't that she thought about Karen and the children every moment. But it moved through her like a chronic condition, appearing suddenly and then fading, only to flare up again at unexpected moments. She'd be watering the hydrangeas and remember Lily's voice from the fence. "Our mom says you're being really mean." She'd see a child walking home from school and think about Marcus having to leave his friends, his school, his entire social structure because of Margaret's need to be right. She'd wake up in the morning, in blessed, perfect, Margaret-chosen silence, and feel completely, utterly alone. In March, she did something she'd been thinking about for weeks. She drove to Riverdale to the address that had appeared on Karen's forwarding mail. She told herself she was just driving by, just seeing if she could find the house. She wasn't going to stop. She wasn't going to disturb Karen's new life. She found the house on a street called Juniper Lane. It was beautiful, a 1970s ranch style, well-maintained with a large yard. There were lights on inside, and through one of the windows, Margaret could see what looked like a family dinner in progress. Karen, the 3 children, and, surprisingly, David, though that might have just been a visit. Margaret sat in her car for 15 minutes, watching through the window like some kind of tragic ghost. Watching her former neighbor eat dinner with her children. Watching them laugh at something she couldn't hear. Watching the thing she'd destroyed and somehow watching it be rebuilt anyway. She drove home without getting out of the car. By spring, Margaret had started volunteering at the library, cataloging books, helping with the children's reading program. It wasn't redemptive work. She didn't do it to make herself feel better about what she'd done. She did it because the silence was worse than anything else, and at least in the library there were people, even if they didn't know her and had no reason to trust her. One afternoon in late April, a woman came in with a young boy. It took Margaret a moment to recognize them, Mrs. Chen and her grandson, David's family. She didn't approach them. Instead, she watched from the other side of the library as Mrs. Chen helped her grandson select books, watched him struggle to reach the ones he wanted, watched her bend down and get them for him with the kind of patient love that Margaret recognized as maternal in a way that transcended blood relation. Later, Mrs. Chen saw Margaret and something crossed her face. Recognition, complicated history, and what might have been pity. Mrs. Chen approached. "Hello, Margaret." "Hi," Margaret said, and it was remarkable how quickly her voice could become small. "How are you?" "I'm well, my grandson is visiting for the week." Mrs. Chen paused, clearly deciding what to say next. "Karen is doing well, by the way. The children are settling in. Thomas is in soccer league. Lily is performing piano at the school's spring concert next month." "That's good," Margaret said, and meant it. "I'm glad." "Are you?" Mrs. Chen asked, and it was asked without hostility, just a genuine question from someone who'd watched the whole situation unfold. "Do you still think about them?" "Every day," Margaret admitted. Mrs. Chen nodded slowly. "Karen thinks about you too. She talks about what happened. She's in therapy working on her part in things, how she dismissed you, how she didn't listen. She accepts responsibility for that." "But that doesn't excuse what I did," Margaret said. "No," Mrs. Chen agreed. "It doesn't, but it might mean something when you're lying awake at night. That she's not thinking about you as a villain. She's thinking about you as another person who was hurt and handled it badly. That's not redemption, Margaret, but it's something." The beat. Margaret has learned that winning isn't the same as being right, and being right isn't the same as being good. She watches her neighbor from a distance, living a life that Margaret had almost destroyed, and understands that consequences aren't just immediate. They're the quiet, ongoing weight of knowing what you're capable of. Margaret was working in the library, shelving returns, when she heard the door open and recognized the voice asking where the self-help section was. The librarian at the desk pointed, and Margaret felt her hands go numb. She didn't turn around. She continued shelving books very slowly, very deliberately, trying not to breathe in a way that would alert Karen to her presence. But of course, that was impossible. The universe had a sense of irony, apparently, and Margaret would not be granted the mercy of not having to face what she'd created. Karen found her own shelving section, and Margaret heard her move through the rows. She was looking for something specific. Margaret could tell by the way Karen was scanning the spines, checking titles. Karen was a reader. Margaret had never realized that until this moment. She was looking for books to help her process something. Margaret turned, pretended to look for something on a lower shelf, and let herself actually look at Karen for the first time in 6 months. Karen had changed. She was thinner, but not in an unhealthy way, more like someone who'd stopped stress eating and started moving again. Her hair was shorter, styled differently, and there was something in her posture that suggested a woman who'd made peace with something. Not happiness necessarily, but alignment. Acceptance. Karen pulled a book from the shelf. It looked like something about healing from conflict or possibly co-parenting after divorce, and turned to leave. She saw Margaret. For a moment, neither of them moved. Karen's expression went through several iterations: surprise, then caution, then something that might have been resignation. Karen walked over. "Hi," she said simply. "Hi," Margaret replied. "How are you?" "I'm good, really good actually, better than good." Karen paused, and there was something in her expression that was almost kind, almost pitying. "I had a session with my therapist last week, and I realized something. I've been holding on to anger at you for so long that I forgot to consider that you might be angrier at yourself than I ever could be." Margaret felt her throat tighten. "I'm sorry, Karen, I don't think I ever actually said that." "You didn't," Karen agreed. "You sent money, you sent birthday cards to the kids, but you never actually said you were sorry for the chickens for driving us out of our home. You just tried to fix it with gestures." "I'm saying it now. I was wrong. I was cruel. I let my pride and hurt become your problem, and that wasn't fair. It wasn't okay." Karen nodded, and her eyes were glistening, but she wasn't crying. "I know, and I've decided that's actually enough for me. Not because I forgive you completely, I don't know if I will actually, but because holding on to rage at you was making my kids see me as someone who was bitter and hurt and couldn't move forward, and I don't want to be that person." "Are you happy?" Margaret asked. "Is your life better now?" "Yes," Karen said immediately. "My kids are happy. We're in a good neighborhood with good schools. I'm dating someone, a really kind man who actually listens. My business is growing. So yes, ironically, your campaign to make my life miserable actually resulted in me leaving a situation that wasn't good for me. My ex-husband had left, the marriage was dead, and I was clinging to a house and a status quo that wasn't serving anyone. You forced me to change, and it turned out to be the best thing that could have happened." Margaret felt something catch in her chest. "So I actually helped you?" "No," Karen said, and the firmness in her voice was almost kind. "You hurt me, Margaret. You hurt my children, but people are resilient. We survived. And now I'm trying to teach my kids that sometimes bad things happen and you survive them and you become better because of your survival, not because the bad thing was actually good." Karen paused. "Does that make sense?" "Yes," Margaret whispered. "I came back to the library today because I was thinking about you," Karen continued. "My therapist asked me to think about closure, about what would make me feel actually done with this situation. And I realized that I needed you to know that you didn't destroy me. You inconvenienced me, you hurt me, but you didn't break me. And I think that's what you were actually trying to do, isn't it? Break me the way you felt broken." Margaret couldn't speak. "I forgive you," Karen said, and there was absolute certainty in her voice. "Not because you deserve it or because what you did was okay. I forgive you because holding on to hate at you was like poison I was drinking and expecting you to die. So I'm setting it down." Karen reached out and briefly touched Margaret's arm. Just a moment of contact, human to human. And then she left, returning to the shelves to collect the book she'd come for. Margaret stood very still, processing the fact that the person she'd thought of as her opponent for the past year had just, in the space of 5 minutes, redefined the entire conflict. Margaret didn't go back to work after that day. She called the library director and said she needed to take a leave of absence. She didn't explain why. She just needed not to see people, not to maintain the fiction that she was doing community service or redemption work or any of the things she'd told herself she was doing. She went home and sat in her backyard and felt the weight of knowing that her cruelty had accomplished something completely different than what she'd intended. She'd meant to teach Karen a lesson. She'd meant to prove that there were consequences for dismissing boundaries. Instead, she'd provided Karen with exactly the catalyst she'd needed to get out of a dying marriage and start a new life. The irony was so perfect it felt almost intentional. The thing about consequences, Margaret understood now, was that they didn't work the way you thought they would. You couldn't target them precisely. You couldn't say, "I will cause this specific amount of pain to teach this specific lesson and then I will feel better." Pain didn't function that way. It rippled outward in unexpected directions, and sometimes, the cruelest irony of all, it made things better for the person you were trying to hurt. Margaret had spent a year imagining that Karen was suffering properly, in a proportional way in response to Margaret's suffering. But Karen had been suffering, and she'd also been leaving. Karen had been hurt, and she'd also been healing. Karen had been forced to face her own shortcomings as a parent, which she'd apparently done with remarkable grace, and had emerged from the experience as someone who could forgive and move on. Meanwhile, Margaret was alone in her backyard with her hydrangeas, waiting for forgiveness from a neighbor who'd already decided to give it. On a Thursday in July, Margaret received a package in the mail. It was from Karen. Inside was a photograph. It was from Lily's piano recital in May. She'd seen the mention in Karen's card, and it showed Lily at the piano, completely focused, absolutely present. Her posture was perfect. Her expression was one of pure concentration and joy. There was a note attached, in Karen's handwriting. Margaret, this is Lily at her spring recital. She played a Chopin nocturne, difficult for a 10-year-old, but she has such focus. I thought you might like to see this so you know that she's okay, that they're all okay. You made a lot of noise in our lives, and for a moment I thought it would drown us out, but we learned to sing louder. Be kind to yourself, the way you're slowly learning to be kind to others. Karen. Margaret held the photograph for a long time, looking at a child she'd never really known, and understood that this was what Karen had meant by closure. Not forgiveness, exactly. Not even reconciliation. But a willingness to show Margaret that the people she'd tried to damage were whole and happy and moving forward. The final beat, Margaret learns that revenge isn't a clean equation. Karen is not destroyed. She's thriving. Lily is talented. Marcus is playing sports. Thomas has friends. And Margaret is left with the knowledge that all her careful cruelty accidentally helped the person she was trying to hurt. The punishment Margaret designed for Karen turned out to be Karen's liberation. The real punishment, the one Karen actually gave her, was kindness and the knowledge that she'd failed to hurt anyone as badly as she'd hurt herself. She called a contractor, not Jim, someone new, someone who wouldn't have baggage attached to her previous projects, and had him remove the fence. It took 3 days. When it was done, she could see directly into Karen's property again, the one she didn't own, the one that no longer had Karen living in it. The new family that had moved in, the Chen family, actually David's younger brother and his wife, which felt like some kind of small neighborhood healing, waved at her occasionally. They were quiet people. They had no children. They left her alone. Margaret planted new hydrangeas where the old ones had suffered the most damage. She let the grass grow in some areas. She stopped trying to control every inch of her backyard and started, gradually, to accept that a garden doesn't have to be perfect to be worth maintaining. She still volunteered at the library, though she'd switched to evening hours when she was less likely to run into Karen. Though after Karen's visit, something had shifted in that too. Margaret wasn't volunteering anymore to atone. She was volunteering because she actually liked books, and helping people find them gave her a sense of purpose. In November, Margaret received a holiday card from Karen. It contained a photo of the whole family, Karen, her 3 children, and a man that Margaret assumed was the kind man her therapist had mentioned. They were standing in front of a fireplace, dressed up happy. Karen had written on the back, "Happy holidays. Marcus made JV basketball. Lily is learning classical guitar now in addition to piano. She decided piano felt too refined. Thomas is actually interested in reading now, which I attribute to a very patient librarian who helped him find the right fantasy series. We're grateful for our life. I hope you are coming to be grateful for yours. Warm regards." The Hendersons and bonus David, who's still figuring out if he fits in the family photo. Margaret put the card on her kitchen windowsill, where she could see it while she did dishes. In December, she started writing. Nothing publishable. Nothing she thought anyone would want to read. Just an account of what had happened from her perspective, trying to understand the moment when defending her boundaries became orchestrating someone else's exile. Trying to articulate the difference between justice and cruelty, which she was beginning to understand were sometimes the same thing, depending on who was doing the measuring. She wrote about the footprints and the fence and the chickens. She wrote about the silence that followed victory. She wrote about Karen's visit to the library and how forgiveness was sometimes less about redemption and more about refusing to let the past define the present. She didn't show it to anyone. Writing it was the point. Witnessing her own actions, understanding them, was the point. On a cold January morning, exactly 1 year after she'd placed the order for the first batch of chickens. Margaret woke up in her quiet house and felt something that might have been peace. It wasn't the peace of victory. It wasn't the peace of being right. It was the quieter peace of accepting that you'd done something you couldn't take back, that the consequences of your actions had rippled outward in ways you couldn't control, and that the person you'd tried to hurt had emerged stronger than before. She got out of bed and made coffee. She looked out at her backyard, peaceful now, properly maintained but not sterile. The hydrangeas were blooming blue and purple against the winter gray. The fence was gone. The property was visible and open. She could see into the neighbor's yard. She could see the Chen family moving about their mourning. She could see, in the distance, the edge of what used to be Corinne's property, now someone else's, someone who would never know the history that had played out here. Margaret thought about the day Corinne had asked her why she was doing this, and Margaret had said it was because Corinne wouldn't listen. But the real answer, the one Margaret was only now understanding, was that she was doing it because she'd felt invisible, because her complaint had been dismissed as trivial, because she'd been alone so long that the violation of her space felt like a violation of her right to exist at all. She could have handled it differently, she probably should have. But she hadn't, and Corinne had survived, and somehow, impossibly, that had become enough.